Just going to do a technical thing, and if I'm going to point, what do I use to point? The center button. Oh no. Here we go. I figured I'd be brave today and actually point on something, so. Okay. Oh, that green. Okay, great. Okay, great. If you are able, why don't you stand up, and we're going to read this scripture, and then you can be seated following that. We'll be referring to this scripture throughout the sermon this morning. I want to begin with it. From 2 Corinthians 2, verses 1 to 4. So I made up my mind I would not make another painful visit to you. For if I grieve you, who is left to make me glad, but you whom I've grieved? I wrote as I did, so that when I came I would not be distressed by those who should have made me rejoice. I had confidence in all of you, that you would all share my joy. For I wrote you out of great distress and anguish of heart and with many tears, not to grieve you, but to let you know the depth of my love for you. Please be seated. Well, this is a picture of an ancient trackway that crossed the small isthmus of Corinth. And this is a 600 BC that this trackway goes back to. And why it was constructed is, we kind of think if you're already in a ship, why don't you just kind of circumnavigate, the southern here and then keep going. But apparently this is very treacherous waters. And so for thousands of years, hundreds at least, the shippers preferred to come through here from the one sea to the other and cross this very small 4 to 6 mile long crossing. And that's what they did. And here's a picture depicting that they actually towed these vessels across this. Kind of fascinating. But this is where Corinth is. We just read from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, and that is the church at Corinth. And we're going to spend our time this morning taking a look at this. This is where it was established, at Corinth. So next Sunday, we're beginning a 12-week sermon series on selected teachings of Paul that are contained in these 2 letters. And, these letters contain a treasure trove of valuable teaching on how Christians are to act and how members within the congregation are to act. And so we're going to set out on this series to look at what we can learn when we look at the Corinthian letters. And, of course, before we just simply dive into the letters, we thought, well, let's take today and give an overview, give some of the background. And so my talk today is an effort to help these letters come alive, help you understand, why did Paul write these letters? What was going on while he was writing these letters? Why did he say what he said? What were the circumstances around it? Well, of course, if you're going to talk about Corinth, you have to start with Ephesus. And you guys are like, oh man, here we go again. Jim, you talked about Ephesus in your sermon in January, and yes, that is true. And I know each of you remember everything I said about Ephesus, so I probably don't need to say anything about it. However, I'll give just a brief overview. And the reason why I'm identifying Ephesus is, and it's just amazing to me, how connected these two cities are, even though they're 400 kilometers apart from each other. And probably the key factor here is that Paul was having a very effective ministry in Ephesus for 3 years, and with great results. Luke, in his book of Acts, tells us that as a result of what they were doing, everybody in the province of Asia, which is over here, everybody in this area had heard about Jesus, whether they were Jewish or Greek. They had heard about Jesus. Well, it was in this context that Paul also was casting his eye and looking at the church of Corinth, which had been established a couple of years later. So I want to just share with you a few things about what was going on in Ephesus so you can then understand what was occupying Paul's mind with respect to Corinth. The one thing I wanted to draw out is in this passage. So let me back up for a second. One of the real things I find really interesting is I really was, initially I was looking at Ephesus. And I was realizing, hey, I can understand what Paul was doing in Ephesus, if I read the Corinthian letters, because Paul wrote those letters from Ephesus. And so here's a couple of examples, just to give you a picture of what was going on in Ephesus. Not just a great work that was going on, a lot of great results, a lot of effort, but to this very hour, we go hungry and thirsty. He's talking about he and his co-workers. We're in rags. We're brutally treated. We're homeless. We work hard with our own hands. When we are cursed, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure it. When we're slandered, we answer kindly. We have become the scum of the earth, the garbage of the world, right up to this moment. So Paul's giving us some insights into Ephesus. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8, he goes on to say, "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about the hardships we suffered in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, that we despaired even of life. Indeed, in our hearts, we felt the sentence of death." Well, it was tough. This was a very, very tough time. And if you just read the accounts in Acts, you go, oh man, this was a great time. Paul was teaching at that lecture hall of Tyrannus, and churches were being planted all over the province, and everything was great. But in amongst all that, he was having such hardship. But also something was brewing with the church at Corinth. Paul had a divided focus, even though you thought Paul would be focused 100% on the one congregation. So let's take a look at Corinth, and then we're going to come back and we're going to dovetail in these different records and happenings between these two cities. So Corinth was a city of, and I found a number of different references as to the size. It sounds like it was a city of about 200,000 free residents and maybe about 400,000 slaves. Of course, that explains why they were so quick to pull those ships across the isthmus, because they had a lot of slave labor to do all that. But that's the kind of city it was. It was a very rich city. To be a Corinthian kind of had that connotation of someone dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure. People knew that they could go to Corinth for whatever advice, they didn't go there for advice, whatever vice that you could imagine. Now, I don't want you to start imagining vices, but they could go there. They knew they could be anonymous. They could indulge in whatever they wanted to at Corinth. And in fact, Corinth was known for that. It was like a vacation. It was, where do you want to pick? It's like going to Las Vegas, I guess. What happens in Corinth stays in Corinth. And So it was that kind of place. It was also a very rich city. This thing about it having two ports and the shipping coming through made it very wealthy. So this is kind of the backdrop to this story of the church in Corinth. And I guess you could summarize it by saying that the fundamentals of Christianity went against the grain of all that the locals knew of religion and society in general. In other words, you talk about oil and water and the not mixing and the trying to mix, is that establishing a church in Corinth, when you understand what kind of city Corinth was, it's just amazing what Paul and his co-workers were able to do when they established that church at Corinth. And by the way, with that, we're not going to go back into the establishment of the church, but you can go back and read in Acts chapter 18 some more details around that. But what we do know is that Paul, after his whole first missionary journey and about half his second missionary journey, he basically hung out in places for about 2 weeks to maybe a couple of months before everybody chased him out of town, tried to kill him. That was kind of the repeating story that happened. And then all of a sudden at Corinth, Paul all of a sudden found he had the protection of the Roman legal system. And within that context, and dare I say the protection of Jesus Christ, he had the ability to stay there for 18 months. So there was this great effective work. And then, of course, he went on and he had that effective work in Ephesus as well, following that for a 3-year period. But he had that great length of time. However, from that time of after establishing it, leaving it, going to Ephesus, there were some things that started to happen in Corinth. And high level, it was the society known to Corinth was coming into the church. And not only that, we'll see in a minute with some examples, it was actually, they were doing some things that was even repugnant to this very immoral society. It was a messy church situation. In fact, let's take a look at some of these. I'm going to give 3 examples of these serious. This is a list of a list that I made in just flipping through the 2 letters, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, because Paul's identifying this stuff with the people. So serious divisions in the congregation. In 1 Corinthians, in fact, 1 Corinthians begins with this in chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. So this is right at the beginning of his letter to 1 Corinthians. Paul says, "My brothers, some from Chloe's household have informed me that there are quarrels among you. I follow Paul. Another says, I follow Apollos. Another, I follow Cephas, who's Peter. And still another, I follow Christ." And so Paul begins confronting some of these challenges. And we'll get into this more, obviously, in our series, but just to give you some snapshots, this immoral culture was taking a grip of the congregation. It was coming into it. There was tacit approval within the congregation for sexual immorality that was frowned upon even by the locals. And if we look at this in 1 Corinthians 5, 1 and 2, we see specifically, it is actually reported there is a sexual immorality among you, and the kind that even does not occur among the pagans. A man has his father's wife, and you are proud. Shouldn't you rather been filled with grief? Lawsuits among the believers. Abuse of the Lord's Supper. We read in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, quite often as we meet around the supper, we begin in verse 23 with, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke and said," etc., etc. So that Paul gives us this beautiful account of the Lord's Supper. But if you look at the few verses before it, listen to what the situation really was at Corinth. "Your meetings are doing more harm than good. In the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you. To some extent, I believe it. Goes on in verse 20, when you come together, it's not the Lord's Supper you eat. For as you eat, each of you goes ahead without waiting for anybody else. One remains hungry, another gets drunk. Some were coming in early. It was a feast. And people were coming in early and snapping up all the food and drinking the wine and getting drunk. I mean, it was just, that's the kind of picture that Corinth was. We have an abuse of spiritual gifts, public attacks against the authority of Paul, which is a big theme in it. The congregation was yoking with unbelievers, and especially dealt with in 2 Corinthians was this idea of false prophets. So let's come back to this idea, this connection between Corinth and Ephesus. So again, I've kind of painted this picture. Paul's in Ephesus, has this 3 years, very effective ministry, but very, very challenging from persecution standpoint to suffering. But, he's all in because he has that foundation, as Jose had said earlier in his thoughts, that foundation on Jesus Christ despite everything else that was going on. So he was not 100% focused on Ephesus. Lo and behold, big problems in Corinth. And number one is he had a number of letters, correspondence that went back and forth. And we know 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. But 1 Corinthians actually mentions in chapter 5, verse 9, I've written you in my letter, in my previous letter, not to associate with sexually immoral people. This is a clue to us that there was actually another letter. It was maybe like a pre-Corinthians 1 or 1A or whatever way you want to call that there is evidence of that 3. And then in 2 Corinthians 2, 3-4, the passage that we read at the beginning, he says, I wrote as I did, so that when I came I would not be distressed by those who should have made me rejoice. And we're just going on to verse 4. I wrote you out of great distress and anguish of heart and with many tears. This is, scholars are divided on this point, and I'm not going to put Nathan on the spot on this one, but I'll talk to you later about it. But they're somewhat divided on this point. Is this another letter? Is this the tearful letter? And there's that description. Or is this really 1 Corinthians? And so there's a little bit of homework for you. You can read 1 Corinthians this week and ask yourself, would this be Paul's tearful letter where he had great distress and great anguish? Either way, what we do note from this is that Paul was passionately concerned about the church in Corinth to the point where he had multiple letters going back and forth. Something else that was happening was there was visitors to Paul in Ephesus. We had Chloe, some people from Chloe's household were coming, and there were some others. There was a Stephanas, and Stephanas actually was the first convert in Corinth. Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus came to Ephesus to encourage Paul and probably to give Paul a report on what was going on, and also probably gave Paul a list of questions that Paul then addressed in his 1 Corinthian letter. So he had this going back and forth. The second thing that was going on with this idea of trips and trips back and forth between the two is that Paul encouraged Apollos to go to Corinth. Apollos actually didn't want to go at first. Paul encouraged him to go. Paul also sent Timothy as his representative. It probably didn't go that well. And Paul later sent Titus to Corinth. And then as we read again at the beginning in 2 Corinthians 13 and 1, or sorry, in 2 Corinthians 12:14, let me back up there. In 2 Corinthians 2:1, so I made up my mind I would not make another painful visit. Well, what was this painful visit? Well, it actually turns out, when you read 2 Corinthians 12:14 and 1 Corinthians 13:1, we can see that Paul was making mention, this is my third letter to you. Well, for those students of the book of Acts, you will find that documents 2 trips that Paul made to Corinth, but it is commonly believed that Paul, while he was in Ephesus, while all that stuff is going on in Ephesus, while he's trying to minister to Corinth and teach Corinth with letters and sending people, he's finally, I've got to go myself. And he just does a straight shot over to Corinth, and he spends some time with them, and that definitely did not go well. In fact, it went so bad, he called it his painful visit, and in fact changed a number of his plans that he had for traveling back. It affected his future plans with them. So just to summarize that part is, you've got Paul in Ephesus, amazing things in Ephesus, and Paul's just using every arrow in his quiver or every weapon in his arsenal to get the Corinthian church back on track and back loving Christ and back loving each other. So within all this is the context now for these 2 letters. And this is what we're going to look at over the next 12 weeks. And I just made a list of some of the different subjects that we're going to take a look at. So when we do go through this, number 1, I would encourage you is to read those 2 letters. Let's start before next Sunday. I'm sure you can get a few chapters through on 1 Corinthians, but maybe the whole chapter, and be ready then for our series. If you consider 1 Corinthians and what we glean from this, you can almost get, I don't know if depressed, but you just go, oh, what a failed effort Corinth was. Started out great, came off the rails, plunged into sinful behavior, and fell off the face of the earth. Well, that's not really what happened. And what we do have is we have clues, especially in 2 Corinthians, because Paul is now pretty upbeat because he's getting now some good reports that some good things are actually happening. And he got one of his major reports he received from Titus. He had sent Titus to Corinth, and he wrote, God comforted us by the coming of Titus. He told us about your longing for me, your deep sorrow, your ardent concern for me, so that my joy was greater than ever. His affection is all the greater when he remembers that you were all obedient. These are one of the most positive statements that Paul makes in this whole package of letters and interactions with Corinth. It pushes away the painful visit. It pushes away the tearful letters. It doesn't negate them, but this story of Paul's efforts with Corinth are turning more favorable. And perhaps there's a sermon in Paul's determination with that. I do want to highlight 1 Corinthians, again, within all this context of dysfunctional congregations and all the struggles and everything, Paul writes 2 chapters that some people would probably put right up there at the top of anything he ever wrote. And the one is the love chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We're not going to read that, but consider that beautiful content about the love of God came out of this very challenging situation. And 1 Corinthians 15, wow, what a passage that is on the whole resurrection of Jesus Christ. And of course, 2 Corinthians ends. I thought I would perhaps end my commentary on this point. Second Corinthians. I didn't have my chapter on that one, but it's probably right at the end. Yes, chapter 13. Chapter 13, verses 11 and 12. So finally, brothers, goodbye. Aim for perfection. Listen to my appeal. Be of one mind. live in peace. And the God of love and peace will be with you. Greet one another with a holy kiss. All the saints send their greetings. And when we think of this letter and how this letter ended, we can take heart that, life is tough. I think, Jose, you said, you said that this morning. I heard this somewhere. Life is tough. And you know what? Relationships within the church are tough. Why is that? Relationships in the nuclear family are tough. Why is that? Well, we can list, we don't communicate, a whole bunch of reasons, family fights, etc. But the bottom line is, it's humans on humans, and that's what we have here, is that we're humans interacting with humans and their challenges, but we've got a rich treasure trove here in these letters, and we're just going to have a great series as we go forward and find ways to apply these wonderful teachings in our lives. I should just mention as a final note on this that Paul did get back to Corinth for that final time and was able to spend 3 months with the church there. There's no evidence that it was that conflict type situation that's more like what we see up on the screen, that it seems like the church then was getting itself back on track. So again, an amazing account. We've been blessed with this record, and I want to leave that with you today as you consider the relationships that we have with one another.